It is actually an honor and a pleasure to be amongst so many like-minded people sharing ideas on advancing liberty. In the past 2 days, I've become inspired and encouraged, and I've learned so many ideas that I think will work back home in Nepal. So let me take this opportunity to thank each and every one of you for sharing your ideas on this platform. Thank you to CCS, ACE, Atlas, Frederick Norman Foundation, Acton Institute, and especially Baishali for giving me this opportunity. So let me start with the topic. Now, when I first received that email inviting me to speak on women in liberty, I'm thankful now, but then when I first received that invitation, I was just very, very hesitant and uncomfortable. I am lazy, but I'm not a socialist by any chance, as we discussed yesterday. I was put through a moral crisis of sorts, I would say. But the journey since then of having to think on this topic sort of enforced on me was a difficult but a very rewarding one, I think. So today I'm just going to share with you about that journey and what I've learned so far. My first hesitation comes from the fundamental belief of classical liberal tradition, that of thinking of individual freedom. So any attempt at collectivizing or putting a category or a label makes me uncomfortable. So I had to think, why are we asking this question in the first place? Let's take a look at the evidence. And even a glance around this room or any of the liberal forums that I have been to glaringly tells us that there are not as many women involved. So I guess it begs the question, why is the half of humanity not as involved? My other hesitation comes from the influence of special interest groups. I am an economist by training, and since I work in the public policy arena, it really makes me uncomfortable to be a part of a potential special interest group, exclusively advocating the right of one group over the right of others. Now, Ministry for Women is a case in point here. I mean, why does the government have to intervene there? And where has there been progress wherever the government has intervened? But then again, it begs the question, does it have to be exclusive rights or just the fight for basic civil, economic, and political rights? And once again, a glance at South Asian regulation and the status of women tells us that women's fight for basic rights in itself, at least in this region, is still a struggle. So in the South Asia context, it becomes human right first and then women's right, which almost puts us in a category not as humans. Another of my hesitation comes from the label of feminism. Now, feminism in this half of the world is very strongly associated with the left movement. So for a believer in classical liberal ideas, that is as red as a flag can get. Yet another issue came from the fact that I've been invited in many, many forums, not for my mind, not for my contribution, but because I happen to represent political correctness. Honestly, this is like a serious turn-off. I wonder if you've ever gone through that. I mean, they say, hello, it's wonderful to see you. Now that we have a woman participant, our quota is complete, so let's begin. And I've gone through that too. So due to all these hesitations, even as a woman in the liberty movement, I'd always shied away from examining the question too closely on why there were not as many women involved. As an economist, I had enough worries about the poor coming from a developing country and operating in an environment where we were fighting with the Maoists. So my plate was a little bit too full, I guess. But I could have found excuses not to think about it as well. So then I was invited to this forum on why women were not as involved in the liberty movement. And I said, I wonder why. Well, actually, I thought I should ask my husband how it feels to have a woman in the liberty movement around him all the time. I'm sure it's tiring. Well, we have friends who often come to our place at the end of the day for a bit of socializing, you know, and there is a joke that runs in my home that everyone calls my husband husband. Hus in Nepali means yes. And band, as you can imagine, is a band playing to someone else's tune, so the wife in this case. Now, if it was a role reversal, if I happened to be cooking and he was the one seated, this joke would not have come around. So I have to deal with the husband situation as well. I started with an internal discussion with my colleagues because they were my closest point of reference. And soon enough, we started reminiscing on our childhood days of how we grew up. That was like opening up a Pandora's box. Here were all my female colleagues talking about their individual fights as a working woman, as someone who needs to assert her right to stay out late at night, or perhaps to finish her work, or just to party out late. The struggle to convince the right to choose her life partner, the struggle for her very private right over her body, be it regarding her sexual relations, reproductive rights, or to even make a tattoo for that matter. And then come to think about it in the regional context, where has the liberty movement in South Asia really addressed these issues? It has been raised time and again by the left, and oh so appealingly that even my faith suffers momentary earthquakes. Now, this initiated my journey into thinking, what have I done for the women's liberty movement, or for realizing or helping her realize her individual freedom, except perhaps struggle through my own? I next turned to my cultural context, one in which I've been ostracized time and again for behaving like a man, for not being submissive and docile, for thinking with my own mind, for not being a dutiful daughter and having too many guy friends, for working from a very young age and staying out of home for very long hours. And in one instance, a bureaucrat even had the audacity to tell me I should act more like a woman. I look at the classic division of role in my society and how male attributes have always been accorded a higher value than female attributes, where the concept of nurture is associated with women, which I have no problems with, but this perception is somehow a weak characteristic that requires protection by a stronger male attribute. It must have been true in hunter-gatherer societies, but do I need to remind that times have changed? And by no means is this a proposal for a role reversal. It's just the recognition of that context that, the weaker sex, that context has changed so much owing to technology and the massive progress made by human beings now. So how do we change this cultural context to adapt to changing times right now? And where in the liberty movement in South Asia has this aspect been highlighted? From then on, I moved to a group of women entrepreneurs. Here were women who I really believed had it all. And to a certain extent, I was proven right. This part of the journey took me potentially to what the liberty movement could potentially do to raise more interest of women in the liberty movement. I met a group of women who could assert themselves and were a lot more confident about their individual rights and standing in society. And it all boiled down to, during the discussion with them, it all boiled down to the fact that they were able to assert their economic right. They were able to keep and decide how to spend their earning and their property. And that made them very, very assertive and very strong women. So let me tell you a story here. It is of Gopi. Gopi is our cook, and she's separated from her husband, and she raises a child by herself. Her husband recently married for a third time, but Gopi is least bit bothered about it. I mean, there was a whole chaos in the office, and we were all speaking in hushed tones, thinking Gopi is really bothered about it. And she was like, I don't care. She earns her living and lives her life the way she wants. She is illiterate, but has fought for her right to property, and I've witnessed it. She has gone to court. She presents to me a classical liberal who may never have heard of the ideas, but lives by it every day. So the question is, where in our movement have we created a space for people like Gopi? So let me come down to my major lessons from the small journey that I took through since being asked to speak on this session. Firstly, I think women can be made equal partners in society through assertions of economic rights. And this implies many, many regulatory changes in South Asia. In Nepal, I know that our right to property itself is still not it's still a struggle. And perhaps if the liberty movement were to raise these issues more often, we could invite more women. Secondly, I think we cannot forget the historical and cultural context of a patriarchal society. What women face in South Asia is real, and the struggle is very real, and I can attest to that. So we need to recognize the context and not brush it aside as a special interest group concern. Perhaps that is another way we can attract more women. Thirdly, we do need better messaging. Women will benefit a whole lot more in a classical liberal society that we envision here. But we have not been able to message it in a way that appeals to them. So I think that aspect of our movement needs a whole lot more attention. Fourthly, I think we need to be a lot more involved in setting the agenda in the feminist movement itself. because the feminist movement right now has been taken over by left. So how do we shift the focus of the feminist movement from affirmative action to the fight for basic rights itself? And lastly, my story is one of struggle to assert my own position. By doing so, and helping at least my female colleagues who work with me to the best of my ability, I hope I've been able to attract a few more females in the liberty movement in Nepal. So perhaps this is yet another aspect where we as women in liberty can actually work as role models. Lastly, I believe that this journey for preparing for this session, I've realized that feminism and classical liberal ideas do go hand in hand, and it doesn't have to be a moral crisis for us to be associated with both movements. But most importantly, like I said, I am no expert in this matter, and what I shared with you today is just my experience, which in the larger academic discourse could be a rather naive view of the world. But the fact that this discourse is actually happening, I think, is a step in the right direction. Thank you for your attention.